Hi guys, welcome to the show. My name is Seb Ostrovich, aka the Voice of the People, and this is the Weightlifting House podcast. Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Weightlifting House podcast with your host Seb Ostrovich, the Voice of the People, joined by, well, Josh, normally I call you the People's Scientist, but now that we have John Kiely on the podcast, I feel like I can't call you the Scientist, so I'm going to go back to calling you the People's Philosopher and introduce to you the real guest of the show. We have the one and only John Kiely. Now, John has been instrumental in changing the way that practitioners think about periodization. His Twitter bio describes him as a senior lecturer in elite performance, an ex-international athlete and coach, S&C coach to Olympic medalists and world champs, rugby and soccer World Cups, part jock, part nerd. John has been particularly influential to Josh, and Josh has been telling me for the longest while that we need to do this podcast. And obviously this podcast has been for, well, coming up to 2 years now, just getting on weightlifting coaches and weightlifting athletes. But because of the work that John has done in the field of periodization, I figured that this would be a phenomenal episode. So I know Josh is very excited. John, how are you doing?
Really good. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Josh, do you want to kick things off? I know that this is probably the most excited you've been for a podcast to date, I'd imagine.
Yeah, and he did just steal my intro for everyone listening. I wrote that out. I was getting that ready and prepared. I thought it was a special moment for all of us. I would read it out. I'd sound like I was knew everything about John, but Seb took my spotlight. So, John, for all the people listening who may not be familiar with who you are, maybe you can just give us some more insight, obviously beyond the Twitter bio, the short amount of characters you can include in that. Just how you got into sport, how you got into research, because I know you're a self-proclaimed practitioner first and then kind of researcher second. So maybe explain why you make that distinction.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I think I might be the wrong John Kiely. The guy you're talking about sounds much better. Self-proclaimed practitioner. I don't think I'm a self-proclaimed practitioner. I just am a practitioner. So basically my background is like most people in the trade, involved in sport at a young age, fascinated by physical preparation. I was a very mediocre combat athlete. But I kickboxed internationally for Ireland. I boxed internationally for Ireland. Wow. Won a couple of national titles in both codes. But, very average. And I've been a coach, for the past 30 years. I've been a coach since I was 22. I have, I guess just by virtue of the athletes I worked with, I've been around the block. That doesn't necessarily mean I know what I'm doing, but I've been around the block. So Paralympics 2004, coached a track medalist. By 2008, for the Beijing cycle, I was the head of S&C for UK athletics.
Wow.
So got to work with a lot of amazing athletes, very talented athletes and staff there. Picked up a few medals at that games. Moved to academia really for practical reasons. Partner back home in Ireland, me stuck over in the UK. Since then, excuse me, I worked with Laura Massaro, who won the squash ladies world title in 2013, phenomenal athlete. From 2014 to 2016, I worked with Irish rugby during competition, so that for people over this side of the world. Six Nations, November Series, and the 2015 World Cup.
Right.
and then I did this summer's World Cup. I was in Russia with the Egyptian squad.
Wow.
So yeah, I kind of see myself really, as the bio said, I'm part jock, a large part jock, but I'm part nerd as well.
Yeah.
In a couple of hours' time, I'll be in a boxing club in Limerick City, and I'll be coaching everything from kids to senior boxers, and that's my weekly life. I might be talking to an elite athlete on Tuesday. Friday night, I'm at the club working with kids. So that's just my life. I'm embedded in the culture from So, going back to the scientist bit, I certainly don't see myself as that. I just see myself as a motivated coach.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I have since maybe 2011. I actually wrote a piece while we were traveling to Beijing. It was the first thing I wrote. It was a coaching piece about periodization, and since then I've written a fair bit, both on my own about periodization and with others, and I enjoy that. I find, if you want to understand something well, write it down and explain it to somebody else, and then you'll understand it truly.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So
amazing.
Anyway, that's where we
amazing.
are.
Yeah. You've basically covered everything. And I actually wanted to take 20 seconds out to say to Josh, you might not realize how quite a bigger deal rugby is over here and everywhere outside of the USA, but to be working with the Irish team, Ireland's unbelievable. In fact, there were times during my childhood where I felt like I almost supported Ireland more than I did England, which was a terrible thing to say to anyone. But they are an amazing team. So to be going to the World Cup, doing the Six Nations, the autumn series is, truly phenomenal. Really, really quite incredible.
Yeah, well, a lot of these things are, and I'm not saying this, I'm not trying to kind of turn this into some kind of humble brag bullshit, but a lot of it is just luck, being in the right place at the right time, and every practitioner that reaches a high level, there's always substantial chunks of luck along the way. So,
yeah. And when you were making that, because obviously we're such a successful athlete, so when you were making that transition from athlete to coach, what kind of spurred that on, and I guess what kept you in the game after that? Because I'm sure there's a big learning curve where you have to figure out how to work with other people, and not kind of just rely on your own. I guess as an athlete, you're relying on your own talents, your own motivation, all of your personality traits that can contribute to success. So how do you work with other people, and how were you able to find so much success doing that?
Well, first of all, just in the interests of telling the truth and not putting fake news out into an already fake news full world. I was not a great athlete. I was a very average athlete. But I guess the transition was very seamless to me. I was coaching at 22.
Wow.
I had my last competitive fight at maybe 37, 38.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, they grew in tandem. When I was about 25, 26, for the first time in my life, I heard of a sports science course in Ireland. So that's when I went to university, So I was already an experienced athlete, international athlete, experienced coach. And then the kind of the academic side grew simultaneously. They all grew in tandem. So there wasn't actually, for me at least, there wasn't a harsh transition.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, every athlete, when they retire, there's a bit of a shock to the system, because one of your major reasons for jumping out of bed in the morning is gone. Mm-hmm. But I think every athlete has that, and I guess I was lucky that I always had coaching, and by that stage I was working with good athletes as well. So I think I was pretty lucky in that I had a seamless enough transition.
Now, I know that you've coached so many different sports, and I'm sure to some extent the periodization that you use has to change to some extent based on the various demands that an athlete is put under, whether they have to develop speed or whether it's just power or agility and all of these sorts of things. But when you look, I guess not from the outside, but almost from the outside of the sport, specifically of Olympic weightlifting, do you look at this sport as though there is one obvious way to periodize your training? Or is it as complicated as me and Josh and everyone seems to make it? Because I think we do a lot in the weightlifting community to make things perhaps seem a little bit more difficult than they ought to be. I'd be really interested to hear what you think as a high-level coach outside of the sport of Olympic weightlifting.
Well, I think that's a really good question, but it's not an easily answered question. So first of all, I think we have really complexified periodization. Maybe that's the wrong way to put it. I think periodization started out as an oversimplistic answer to a very complex question. That's how it started out. And I think we invented rules that weren't there. We invented right ways that weren't really there or weren't rooted in fact. So we had this complex thing and we made it simple along one dimension. And I think the past few years, the evolution has been to take away some of those rules or things that we had assumed were doctrine. And perhaps then, so we've de-simplified it. We have, in a lot of sports, starting to put a lot of technological measures around the athletes. And we've kind of hoped that the data would answer our questions.
Yeah.
But for me, at the root, and I don't think, I think they're equally bad. You can swing one way and be very dogmatic and rigid in your thinking. You can go the other way and be very flexible and be very, very responsive to data. But I think that there's a middle ground that is, in a sense, it's simple in terms of there's, I think, relatively straightforward common sense guidelines. But it's the problem with common sense, I guess. It's not always very common. And I think our heads, our culture is so full of presumed rules and assumed rules that it gets in the way. So I guess as a kind of a short answer, a long answer to the short question, I think it is, like so many things, it's kind of how can we resolve this complexity in a relatively straightforward and simple way. That to me is the challenge. And I think we can do that. In relation to different sports, they all have different takes, but what you do find with their very good coaches, there's always a plan that they gravitate towards for whatever historical reasons. Maybe they did it before, or a coach they really respected, and they've always added and taken away from that plan as they've evolved as practitioners. But I think what really separates the great coaches from the not so great coaches is their ability to get the athlete to buy into that plan and believe in the plan and believe in the coach and believe in the process, and also to set processes and kind of information gathering systems that mightn't be formalized, they mightn't be empirical in terms of something that's scientifically measured, but they collect information and adjust and adapt in a sensitive way. And sometimes it's very hard to look at great coaches in different sports and pick out what are the common denominators, because often they differ across so many dimensions. But the one thing that I see is that they all engender belief from the athlete and faith from the athlete and respect from the athlete. And I think that their periodization programs or their training specific expertise, sometimes that can vary in standard, but what's always there is the athlete's belief in that coach and belief in their systems and their program. And I think that's something we've totally underestimated.
Right.
And I've come across dozens of coaches who were technically excellent, but they just couldn't sell that belief to the athlete.
Right.
And other coaches who maybe hadn't that technical brilliance, but they could just inspire faith. And that's the ingredient that I haven't really seen the great coach who didn't have that ingredient.
Yeah, and
I love that.
Just backtracking a little bit, not to get too far away from what you were just talking about, but just to briefly explain a point you made about the oversimplicity of periodization to a complex problem. Maybe you can just briefly go over the background or how periodization was originally kind of implemented in sport to solve this or provide an answer to a problem that coaches had.
Yeah, because I mean, I was going to jump in there and say as well, because when you said that, I wanted to say, well, what is the problem? And what is the answer? What is the answer? What is this problem that we're trying to solve exactly? So yeah, if you could actually just give us an idea of roughly what that problem is, as well as then how people are going about solving it.
Okay, perfect. Well, maybe the first thing to clear up is it's a loaded term, periodization.
Yeah.
Like, and we all use it in lots of different contexts. And I suspect that a lot of the time we're using it, and what it means to me is different to what it means to you, is different to what it means to the next coach. When I think of periodization, like a lot of the time it's used as a synonym for planning. It's basically just means the same as training planning.
Yeah.
But the word originated for a specific type of plan, the type of plan that was broken up into predetermined periods which had a different training focus and were designed to lead to different physiological changes in the athlete. So that's the original context. So I think it's just useful to be aware that when I've criticized periodization, I've been talking about that specific definition. This idea that you can, like an omnipotent being, plan, this is what's going to happen, and in 6 weeks' time you will have developed these capacities, and then in the next 6 weeks we'll overlay this capacity, and etc., etc. So that was the original concept. Now, getting back to your question in terms of what's the problem, I think obviously the periodization models predominantly emanated from the old Soviet Union at a time when they were dominant in sport for a whole host of reasons. Everybody talks about the drug-related reasons, but I suspect that wasn't even the main one. You know, a lot was you just prioritized physical activity, sports, coaching. You kept athletes in the sport as coaches. You know, they did a whole load of things right as well as things wrong.
And there was a lot going on politically, just with them trying to dominate the USA in everything from the space race to the Olympics. And I think that was one of the things as well that can't be overlooked in why they did so well during that era.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think a major thing was the focus they put on physical education and the priority they gave that role. If you were a PE teacher or a coach in Russia or in the old Soviet Union, that was a really respected job.
Yeah.
And I think there was a lot of good in that. And again, you know, their efforts to retain athletes that were injured out of sport young and things like that, and to re-educate them as coaches. They were obviously doing a lot of things right. To get back to your question, I think, and we have to put this in the context of the time that periodization evolved. And there was a very different kind of worldview. I've written about this before, so I don't want to be going over old ground, but there was, both in industry, in politics, in science, a very mechanistic worldview. It was like let me see. An example I keep coming back to because it's such a startling one was the 5-year plans of Soviet Russia in Lenin's time. It's just, here's this really big, huge, complex problem. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to break it down, make it simple. First, we're going to do this. Then we're going to do this. Then we're going to do this. Mm-hmm. Sounds great. And it sounds really like, we're determined and we're motivated and forget all that crap. We're going to do this. But as soon as you ignore complexity, you open the door to all kinds of problems. And that's what happened. There was famines. There was all kinds of social upheaval. And sometimes they hit their goals, but at a huge, unconscionable cost. And I guess that was just, on a macro scale, that was just an example of a really bad periodized plan. Mm. If something is complex and you reduce it too much into the wrong kind of simplistic guides or guidelines, then the wheels will come off.
Mm. I mean, that is interesting because we in weightlifting tend to almost romanticize all of the research that came out of the Soviet Union. Verkhoshansky and Medvedev are people that we kind of look at as these gods of coaching and periodization. And weightlifting's almost fallen into these two camps where you're either in that camp where you're just thinking, you know what, we need to plan everything. We need to account for all volume intensity, track everything over this essentially 4-year Olympic quad, or we're just in the 12-week 10s 5 3s max, 10s 5 3s max. And like we've got this little bit of a split. So it's actually interesting to hear you say that you look back at the flaws in that training model because we, like I said, we really romanticize those papers and that research from that time.
Well, I think it's the same in the sporting world, or at least it has been until relatively recently, that the old Soviet research was God, effectively. Mm-hmm. But I think it was sold to us under false pretenses. It tends to be a very rigid worldview, and it was born out of a time when our understanding of a lot of phenomenon was very mechanical. It was, and in weightlifting terms, if I do this many reps at this percentage of max, this will be the outcome.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, what we know now, and I have a doctoral candidate, Craig Pickering, and his interest is in genetics. And I mean, like Craig, he was an Olympic sprinter himself, and he's knocked out a number of papers in the past few years that are really worth the read. And it's really just demonstrating that the three of us here, you give us all the exact same stimulus, and it doesn't matter if that stimulus is 6 cups of coffee or a physical training stimulus, we will all respond in different ways.
Right.
Some of us will have training triggers we're highly reactive to. Some of us will have training with this. I might not respond to the same training trigger, vice versa. You might not respond very well to something that I respond very quickly to. And I would suggest that, although the evidence isn't really very clear at the moment because people haven't done the work, I think that those triggers and predispositions may change over time as well with training history. The bottom line is, it is extremely hard to predict what effect a given training program will have on somebody. Now, the complication is, if I'm the coach and I put a lot of time and effort into constructing a training program, am I going to view it or evaluate it in a fair and unbiased way, or am I going to be always primed to see positive in it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so and classically what happens is, if I'm working with an athlete and the athlete does well, in my head I'm saying the idea I came up with is working. If I give the same program to that athlete's identical twin brother and they don't have good results, very naturally we kind of think, oh well, that's something that they did wrong. And, basically in human nature, we have all these kind of self-protective biases and voices in our head that protect our egos. And that's fine. And we, if there's an evolutionary bias or basis to that, but it becomes very hard to learn then if we're only evaluating ourselves. So, and that's why I think periodization becomes such a mess. It's that it evolved from basically a couple of Soviet heavyweights going toe to toe with each other saying, here's what I think, here's why, follow my lead, join my periodization religion. And, Verkhoshansky does it, Matveyev does it, Bamba, whoever it may be. And that's fine. And obviously, I'm not having a go at them. I'm just saying that they were the heavyweights. They influenced us. But they were all running solo. They were all looking at my theory, my way forward. And I think you could argue that periodization was very useful at a certain time because we didn't really know what we were doing. And, there's a saying, to a person who's lost, any map is a help. And I kind of think of that in terms of periodization. Training can be very complex. We don't really know what we're doing. And sometimes it's good to just say, here's what you do. Yeah. And for you to buy into that.
Yeah.
But if we want to move forward, if we want to evolve this field, then I think we got to go a bit deeper. We got to think through some of the hard problems, and we have to maybe push away the security blanket of follow this plan, and think, well, should I follow that plan? Maybe what I need to do is I can start with that plan, but let me critically evaluate what's working, what's not working. Let's make sure that I don't become a prisoner to this idea that this is the plan, and just that I can evolve, I can check, I can learn, and for me, I think learning is impossible if you have a rigid idea in your head. If you have a rigid belief, then it's very, very hard to learn.
Yeah. That's interesting. In fact, a few coaches kind of just came to my mind when you said that last line. If you've got a rigid belief, then you can't continue learning. I think that's fantastic, but it almost leaves, I can imagine it leaving coaches a little bit nervous because we all like to think that there's one plan that we can follow. And if we understand a certain type of periodization, whatever it might be, then we can just stick to that and that's going to be the way to do it. But by saying that almost everything works and so much of it is the athlete buying into you and everything, it makes things more open and so many more possibilities of things that could go wrong, essentially. So are there yeah, go on. Yeah.
Well, what I was going to say is, I think that's an illusion. The illusion that if I stick to the plan I know, I'm safer. That's not the case.
No, probably not. Yeah.
Training is inherently, there's risks. And sticking to what you know isn't necessarily the best way at all. Now, I do think that there are, I think there are certain guidelines that we can use that can help us navigate this kind of unknown terrain. But before I get into that, I mean, what I would also say is that a lot of this depends on the coach's background, the kind of how much the coach has thought about this and how much experience the coach has. So if it's a young coach, I don't see any problem with them buying into one specific periodization model. As long as that model is sensible and as long as buying into the model doesn't mean that they shut down their brain, assume it's right. Because inevitably with training, if you do too much too soon, you're going to run into problems. If you do too little, or it takes you too long to make progress, you're going to run into problems. So it's a very, very hard target to hit. you certainly can't hit it by some basic guesswork that you made 6 weeks or 6 months ago when you were laying down the plan.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone will respond differently, as I mentioned. But again, what I would say is, if it was a young, inexperienced coach, I don't see any problem with buying into a plan. But as you learn more and see more and make more mistakes, I think kind of the onus is on you as a coach. I mean, athletes are putting their trust in you for you to grow as a coach, and for you to evolve your ideas and your processes. And I think processes is something that I mention a lot when I think or talk about periodization or planning, because my perspective is you can't foretell what will happen if you do a certain type of training. So you need to be sensitive to evolving information.
Uh-huh.
Now, in some sports at the moment, what that means is everybody's wired up. You have technology, you have GPS, you have a lot of money, you're a big football club. But in a lot of sports, it's just the coach and just the athlete.
Yeah.
And it's the coach's experience and how the coach extracts relevant information from the athlete. And the best coaches will do it subtly. I mean, it won't necessarily have to be a big process. It'll be the same couple of questions that are asked on a very regular basis. But there has to be some way of extracting relevant information from the athlete. Otherwise, it's very hard to. Otherwise, you're kind of turning your nose up against, turning away from critical information that you should be factoring into your decision-making processes. So I don't know if I went totally off track there. You did ask the way I think what you said is, what's the problem? Well, the problem is, we have this task as coaches that's really complex. We've tried to solve that by coming up with oversimplistic guidelines. 4 weeks of this at this percentage, this many reps, week off, 4 weeks of this. I think what's the solution or where it will go in the future, and I think that's about the coach having a framework that they feel, I think that this works. I'm judging that not based on what some old Soviet wrote 40 years ago. I'm basing it on my current level of experience, what I see around me, conversations with other coaches, anything I can do that stimulates my thought processes. I'm basing it on that. I'm going to decide what my plan is, but now I'm going to track it and monitor it in some way. And monitoring, again, it doesn't have to be high tech. It can just be, I'm going to debrief with the athlete on a regular basis. And I'm basically going to put my plan to the test. Are we getting what we think we're getting from this? If not, how can we tweak it the next time round? How can we do this phase differently the next time round? So I guess it's more a promotion of turning training into a learning experience for the athlete and the coach. Nobody in the world can tell you in advance, this is the best training program. The best we can do is put our best foot forward, make our best guess, and then observe, record, tweak, slight direction change, and move forward in that way.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it earlier about how genetics play into the responsiveness of a person to a training plan. And then when we're thinking about how other aspects can kind of influence someone's response to training, what would those variables look like? Like, what influences the way someone responds to a training plan? Because if we're thinking of it as this like rigid plan that we kind of jot down to follow, what day-to-day, I guess, like variables would kind of create someone or put someone in a position to not have a successful training session, or to not be able to adapt in the long term. That's kind of outside of the coach's control.
That is exactly what I was going to ask. That's what I want to know.
Well, it's a brilliant question, and it's a question that historically, at least in the literature, we ignored. My sense from talking to coaches from different generations and from reading about what some of the coaches did way back, 30s, 40s, 50s, I think great coaches always knew that it wasn't just the mechanical execution of exercises. But anyway, to get back to your question, yeah, genetics plays a role. I think, and I don't want to dive into this too much, but early life experiences play a role. Were you active? Were you not active? Did you suffer a lot of trauma in childhood? Did you suffer no trauma in childhood? All those type of things, they will feed into how you respond to future stressors. And I guess there's a science behind that now in terms of what's called epigenetics, or pretty much permanent, long-term or short-term changes in the way your genes are expressed, brought about by past experiences. So it's not even as easy as nature and nurture. It's nature expressed through nurture.
Wow.
So, but as regards, by the time we see athletes, what can we control? Well, I think the two big ones for me that we've totally ignored culturally, one is stress. And maybe just to dive into that a little bit, a lot of periodization theory, if you ever read an academic periodization paper, it's like you have to by law mention Hans Selye. It's like, and Hans Selye was this researcher in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, but started in the 30s. And his general adaptation syndrome is always cited as the foundation of periodization.
Yeah.
And basically, you could break it down into, if you get physical stress, you'll get a physical adaptation out the other end. And then it's all about the right amount of physical stress. Too much is bad, too little is bad. So it's actually, on the face of it, it's very common sense dressed up as academic validation. I guess what has become really clear since the 70s is that, well, actually, psychological stress is physical. So, if something stressful is going on in your life, now stressful could be a fight with your partner that leads to a bad night's sleep, that leads you waking up in a bad mood on the morning of training. It can be something as simple as that. Now, what that bad mood is, and the circumstances that set that bad mood, what that has done is changed your biochemistry, essentially. Predominantly the chemistry in your brain, which affects everything else, which affects downstream changes, which will affect hormonal expression and a whole slew of other downstream consequences. So then if we do the thought experiment, we've two genetically engineered twins. They both had the exact same experiences all through life. They both had the exact same training stresses. They're both coming in to do the exact same training session in the exact same way. Everything is identical. The only difference is one of them is pissed off with something and the other isn't. They will have different training outcomes.
Wow.
Purely because they're overlaying training stress on a different biochemistry. So I guess your question was, what can we do? Well, I think the first thing is we can start to take control of that a little more. So as a really practical example, the easiest thing to do is maybe just educate your athlete a little bit. You know what, if you were freaked out about something, or if you were somebody who is easily stressed, we need to identify what those triggers are, perhaps, or identify the time of the month, the time of, the day, the week, the academic year, when you were feeling those stresses more severely, and we need to factor that into our decision making. So, I mean, the classic one is university athletes get injured way more around exam times. So the obvious thing to do is, well, okay, let's adapt our training. Let's moderate our training. No, that's not the only answer. There could be more subtle answers there, but as a simple example. So, as an example of very simple strategies that don't interfere with your periodized plan, but that do need to be planned to be effective. If an athlete rocks up to the gym and they are anxious, or they are in really bad form, they've just come from, they've had a flare up with somebody on the motorway, something like that. Having a strategy there where, okay, you need 5 minutes out. Or I've done it where you give it to the whole squad. We're not doing that for 5 minutes. Have a look at your training logs. Remind yourself about why you're here in the first place and what this is about. Basically, anything at all that will just help the athlete park all the crap that goes on in all our heads all the time. They just think, actually, you know what? I need to stop thinking about that. This is training time. I have a goal here. I have a dream up here, and this goal is going to contribute to me achieving that dream. Now I need to get in the right zone to properly execute this training session. Now, so you could think of that as a switch on intervention. There's something around there, it's something in that that's a switch on for the athlete. As athletes get more used to it, they can switch on more quickly, and all great athletes can do this. Perhaps at the end of the session, there's the same. There's a debrief, which can be really, really, really quick and practical. If it's one-on-one, you have more scope. If it's with a squad on a tight schedule, it can be, okay, are we good? Did we have a good session? Here's what we're going to do the next time we meet again. So you're giving them a view to the future, and then some switch off routine. Right. And different people will have different routines. And I think you'll find a lot of great athletes they probably haven't intellectualized this or even realized they've done it. But most people come up with some type of routine or ritual that puts them in the zone, and then some type of routine or ritual that switches them off. Say, okay, training is over. I go for the next couple of hours. I get on with the rest of my life until I'm back at the gym again, or whatever it is. So I'm after saying quite a lot there. Did that make a degree of sense?
It made all the sense in the world. Yeah, it was fantastic. Yeah. So go on, Karen.
So sorry, I was.
Yeah.
Because I'm aware that this can easily turn into kind of waving our hands in the air and talking about very fluffy, obscure constructs, but this is stuff that I personally have used with athletes, and I know other people that have used them with elite athletes. And when you get into the habit of setting processes and setting switching on times and switching off times, it reduces athlete stress quite a bit, especially even with, and I've seen this with very top level athletes who maybe travel a lot. Setting routines around sleep, setting little rituals pre-competition, and really it's just the same as you'd have a well-organized warm-up before a competitive event. It's just having a planned out day before an event as well. So for example, and I'll give you this example and I'll shut up then because I could keep talking about it forever. You're traveling, you're playing a tournament, and it's knockout stages, and you're moving through the rounds, and that's quite stressful. And a lot of people would suffer from, they'd start worrying about the competition more and more and for longer and longer during the day, and then it starts eroding sleep, and then there's a whole negative spiral you fall into. But if you can get the athlete into those routines where there's you know what, I'm not going to worry about this. I have something big and important to me tonight, but I'm not going to get anxious about it all day. What I'm going to do is that at 1 o'clock, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to think about it for 20 minutes. And then I switch off, and I'm going to do something I enjoy doing and that takes my concentration. And it's never perfect. You can't totally switch off your brain, but there is something about thinking, I actually don't need to worry about this because I have a designated time over here where I am going to worry about it or think it through. That really stops all that stress kind of bleeding out over the course of a day. And that's the thing about the stress response. The stress response isn't a bad thing, obviously. It's an evolutionary survival mechanism that's designed to sharpen our cognition, our memory, our visual acuity, to make us better. But it's designed for short-term exposures. Mm-hmm. And, that kind of bleeding out of stress hormones over the course of a day can be very toxic and very corrosive. So anything we can do to switch it on, switch it off for limited time periods is definitely in the athlete's benefit.
Amazing. Now, I'd love to know, well, actually, one of the things I wanted to say first, you were talking about, it's so much more to do with the coach actually trying to understand the feelings that the athlete is going through, watching them and basically kind of, to some extent, deciding the path that we're going to go down on the day, rather than, like you said earlier, planning weeks and weeks and months in advance. And I remember one of the guys that I'm good friends with, he's actually a coach from Ireland. He's called PJ Dundas. He now lives in Exeter with me. He might have even been quoting you, but he said that one of his favorite coaches, and I know that you're one of his favorites, said something like when they used to go to coach their team, what they'd do is every day they'd make them all do some foam rolling. And he said he didn't even make them do foam rolling because it was particularly a good thing to do. It was that if they were all in there and they were all being loud and joking, he just knew that they were good to go. And then the days when they would come in and it's just silence for 5 minutes, that's the day he knows, okay, we're not training hard today. And he would just use that as his, one of his metrics for whether to push training. That could have been you. Or was that? Have you said something similar to that before?
I don't think in relation to foam rolling, no.
No.
But
no.
I mean, if there's any way I can,
yeah.
If there's any way I can take credit for it, I will. But,
well, I'm sure Josh and I can work on trying to spread the rumor that was you.
Yeah, great.
We'll do our best.
I guess because we were talking about stress, I think that when athletes come to competition, and in the psychological literature, stress is really synonymous with a perceived lack of control. Now, if you're going to a new stadium, in a totally new environment, you are out of control. You're not in familiar surroundings. Stress will be exacerbated. But what you can do is, you know what? I'm in a different place, different people around me, whatever it is, but I have my routines, I have my rituals, I know what I'm doing. And if weightlifting as a solo sport is a very stressful sport, as are the combat sports. And I think it's all about finding, here's my groove, here's my routine. Doesn't matter where I am, what it looks like, how many people or cameras are there. I slot into my groove, and then I know what I'm doing. I know what's first, I know what's second, I know what's third. And it keeps your mind focused on the next step rather than focused on, oh my God, this is a huge stadium, I don't think I'm going to be up for this, and that whole negative cycle. And I think it's a pretty simple trick, but it's a pretty effective trick. It's not even a trick. It's just if you want somebody to perform well, then they need to get themselves into that right zone. It's not just to warm up their body, but emotionally, psychologically, cognitively, they all need to get into the right place. So we need to have this kind of multi-layered warm-up. And I think the best way to do that is habits, routines, rituals. Now, it can be very hard from a practical perspective. Like, you can't go and every time you lift in the gym, if you do the same ritual or routine at the same intensity as the national championships, it just doesn't have the same effects. But what you can do is a skinny version on a regular basis, and then a more elaborate or a longer version at a big event. But it's all about, I have a process, I plug into my process, and it's nearly about diligence and professionalism, and I have to take my pre-prep really seriously, and importantly, not leave it to chance. Not just I'm walking into the stadium and somebody says something that gets up my nose and I start losing the plot, and then a whole negative stream of thoughts are kicked off. It's more like, hey, I know what I'm doing, I can block this out, here's what I do.
That makes complete sense. And actually, Josh and I almost spoke about that on a smaller level a couple of days ago. We were talking about just within the 20 to 30 seconds before you pull the bar off the floor, and how you almost have to have, the lift starts when you're sat on the bench, and everything from that moment, from when you stand up, you go over, you chalk your hands, you get your straps if you're lifting the straps, everything you do, where you grab the bar, how you breathe, it's always the same every time, and it just gets you into this sense of comfort. You know what's happening, and then it kind of means that the start of the lift isn't this big crazy moment, because the movement's already begun. It began 20 seconds ago when you stood up off the bench, and it's like that, but in a much grander way, and probably a more important way, to have the few hours before. I mean, we used to have it with rugby. We'd have on game day, you'd all do the same thing every time, and obviously I was just a schoolboy, and we were doing it for the fun of it. But I mean, whenever I've spoken to or heard interviews with the best athletes in the world, they always talk about their game day routine or their pre-match routine or something like that. Well,
yeah, I mean, and as I said, people tend to gravitate towards that. And I mean, you'll never see an international rugby kicker who doesn't have a routine absolutely nailed on before they kick.
Right, yeah.
I guess what we're doing is saying, well, look, that's on a micro scale, but there's routines and rituals on a macro scale. And I guess how we got onto this is that if you think of stress as a perceived lack of control, you feel like things are getting out of my control here. I don't know if I can handle this, and I don't know how I'm going to react. The way to start getting around that is to seize control over something small, something that you can control. And, in extreme contexts, people going through torture and something like that, that's what they're trained to do. Try and just get some little toehold, some tiny bit of control. And that gives you something that you own, if you like, that you can hang on to in this kind of sea of out of controlness. You have your one little island that you can grip, that you have a toehold on.
It's actually very interesting. I mean, you even see that with, when things are out of your control, and you look at prisoners, and basically they have to do whatever they're told to do for however long they've got their sentence. But they take such care over the very small things, making sure their bed looks right, and all these little things that they can control, just to give themselves some level of just being in charge of their daily routine. And I think probably the more stressful the event. So, for example, if you've got to convert the ball after you scored a try, that's a very high stress event. So having these habits right before those specifically is probably more important than in front of something that's, maybe going to be difficult, but not quite so stressful or intense.
Absolutely. It's a way of seizing control. It's the exact same for lifters in the example you gave. How you walk to the bar, your breathing, the self-talk in your head, and I presume that most lifters will have a kind of a self-talk narrative that is running in tandem with the physical actions.
Yeah.
And maybe some type of go signal when you lock in, when you're just before you lift. There's probably some type of cue that you give yourself.
Yeah.
And I guess the point that we're kind of talking around here is, can you scale those up to your benefit when you're training? And I think you can. There's one other quick thing on the stress stuff, and that is that there's the stress management is a term we throw around all the time, and it's tempting to suggest that one type of intervention will work for everyone. But what I found working with athletes is some athletes will respond to breathing exercises, and most kind of do, but it might not be the classical mindfulness that is everywhere in our kind of environment at the moment. Not everyone gravitates to that, and I've been in environments where people are impelled to do it, and it becomes a stress because I really don't like doing it.
Yeah.
So but that's the thing with stress relief, it has to be something that speaks to you personally. Things that I found useful with athletes are, there's a lot of evidence on the value of exposure to nature. And in most cities, you'll be able to get a park or a little bit of wooded area or anything at all. And a walk through that can be pretty, or seems to be, or at least it works for quite a few people. Expressive writing, and that could be, you're really nervous, you're going to bed, there's a lot of thoughts in your head, open your book, 10 minutes, write them down on the page, close the book. And that act of closing the book on those thoughts is kind of designed to capture them there. I'll pick that up again tomorrow, but I'm switching it off for now.
Yeah.
Now, so, and all of those things I think are incredibly useful. And I guess just the final thing I'd say about the whole stress thing is, we put so much effort and time into designing training and executing training and evaluating training, and the athlete puts so much brain power and effort and motivation into it. I think we should also take care of business on the easier sides of that, having some routines and rituals, having talked through it with athlete or coach. And inevitably, you're never going to find the right process straight away. But same as with training, try, experiment, evolve, learn, tweak. That's the process. I'm sure we're running out of time here. There was just one other thing I wanted to touch on that I've become to believe or to think is really powerful, and I mentioned it at the start. And we always think that, and we're all brought up to believe that in a sense, the only driver of how good the athlete will become is the physical training program, the mechanics of the physical training program. And I think what we've neglected to do is put enough effort into selling that program to the athlete, so the athlete has belief in that program. And again, I'm not suggesting that for any kind of fluffy or obscure reason, other than if you believe in something, again, belief isn't just some fleeting kind of momentary mood that flashes through your brain. It is a chemical. There is a chemical signature to it. And again, so it's about creating the fertile ground for training adaptations to occur. But if you have belief and if you're racked with doubt, if you don't think you can handle something, there's a chemical consequence to that will drive a host of downstream changes that will start to turn that negative belief into a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we can do it the other way, if we can engender belief If we can make sure that the athlete understands that, hey, coach has my back, coach has my best interest in heart, I can talk to coach, I can go to coach and say, this isn't really working for me, can we work something else out? If you have that, if you can foster that type of relationship, then that is really powerful. And again, if I was given the choice between, a technically perfect program with an athlete that didn't really believe in it, or an average program with an athlete who bought in heart and soul, I'd go with option 2 every time.
Yeah. I love that. There's actually a story that I spoke to a guy on the podcast called Norik Vardanian. His dad, you might even know of him, was a lifter from the Soviet Union called Yurik Vardanian. And by Sinclair, he's the second best weightlifter of all time. He clean and jerk 224, weighing 82. An unbelievable athlete, but he was all about, he had these routines and these plans and this self-belief. And what he kind of instilled in his son, Norik, that Norik was telling me about, was his dad would always say, this is the weight that you're going to hit today. And every day Norik would go in and he'd make that exact weight. And his dad never said something that he wasn't able to do. And so it meant that just he bought into this system where anything that his dad said, he knew would happen. And he'd go to competition, and for the winning lift, if his dad said, you've got to snatch 163 to win the snatch portion of this competition, even though he'd never done it before, every time his dad said what he was going to hit, he hit it. And so not only was he, did he kind of believe he would do it, but then he would attack that weight with a different, a different level of intensity, or he had a certain increased level of confidence just because he really went for it as though it was already going to happen. He already knew he'd made the lift. And he said that was very, very much instrumental in his success in, becoming an Olympian, essentially.
Well, I think that's a great story. And that's really what that was a father and son, obviously a very tight relationship and a lot of one-on-one exposure. It's harder to foster that level of belief, but we need to do it if we really want to reach our potential as coaches. The way I think about this is, obviously, what the placebo phenomenon are. So essentially, placebo are, things that shouldn't make any difference, but they do make a difference.
Yeah.
And a substantial difference, like estimated, certainly in certain things like depression and fatigue, pain, they can make big differences. And now fatigue, depression as in psychological state, and pain, they overlap substantially with our world, right? Because they're the things we're fighting, if you like. Psychological, emotional turmoil, subjective feelings of discomfort. That's our world.
Right.
So I think of these things as placebo effects. And again, what all placebo is, it's not a trick, it's not deception. I think there's good, honest placebo that great coaches do. And that placebo is you're not lying, you're not like bullshitting to someone, you're not deceiving someone, but you are, again, nurturing and fostering that sense of coach believes in me. Now, and it's not baseless because I've proven it. We have done this together, and you're building that kind of solid foundation of positive expectation and belief. Now, and I think as coaches, we do that very subtly over time, because you'd lose all credibility if, you're going to lift something that's completely out of your range and you're not going to do it. But we can do it gradually and subtly. And again, it's how we present to the athlete. Do we always present in a way that is consistent, so we're not subject to mad mood swings or anything like that? We're predictable, we're reliable, we reliably give feedback. The athlete knows we put thought into what they do. They know that we're emotionally invested in them. I think all those type of things have a huge benefit that sit far outside of how good we are at prescribing how many sets and reps and bar speed and so on.
And just flipping the lens there really quickly, I know Seb and I have discussed this, but as coaches who are giving athletes a plan to follow, sometimes we experience doubt in those plans, and it's tough to be fully committed to it because there are so many unknown variables influencing performance.
Especially with long distance athletes, like we have a few of.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the hardest.
So how can we kind of distill that belief and empower the athlete and reconcile our own doubt with the plan? And I guess not like convey an artificial confidence, but just make them believe that we believe, even if there's some uncertainty there, because obviously no plans are impenetrable. So
you've got to show them that you care, I guess, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think, I think you definitely, if you want an optimal response, the athlete needs to know that you care, that you're invested. But now, I also think that we need to be, genuinely and authentically ourselves. I mean, I think it would be ridiculous if I was going in to meet an athlete for the first time and I was trying to be some funny kind of joker guy. It just wouldn't be me. And so I think it's just, you go and you present yourself in a way that is consistent, because ultimately if they're a motivated athlete, they don't care if you're the funniest guy or not. They care about, hey, you know what, this coach thinks things through, and they always have my best interest in heart, and I can talk to them, I can communicate with them, I can relate to them, and they'll push back, but anyway, to get back to your question, Josh, and I think here's where there becomes a lot of confusion with periodization. I think sometimes a periodized plan is a good thing for an athlete at a certain stage of their career, because, as we said, it can be complex and it can be daunting. And you've heard of the concept of cognitive overload. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so cognitive overload is just if I'm doing a lot of things, if my thought processes are firing on all cylinders, that's essentially, in a general way, taking away resources from me. And there has been studies done. There's not a lot of them yet, but there certainly is some. You get an athlete, you give them a lot of cognitive tasks before they train, and their training adaptation is diminished compared to those who didn't get the cognitive task before training. So that's quite an observation. I mean, and it means, in terms of if we're back to planning, it's not just part of the function of the routines and rituals is to reduce cognitive overload, because they're automatic habits. Yeah. But what it might also mean is for, that if you were the type of coach who was racked with doubt and has to have a long conversation about everything in detail with the athlete, that might not be serving the athlete's best purpose. Mm-hmm. So to go back to your earlier question, it was your question actually, Josh, I think, about if you're not sure about what to do, if you don't know the best way forward, I think what I would do is I would sit. I would give myself a certain amount of time to come up with the best solution I could, and then I would park it. Now, if it was a novice athlete or with low training experience or low training education, I wouldn't give them all the complexities and all the ifs and maybes, or I wasn't sure. I would just present to them, here's what we're doing, here's why, here's how it's going to help you. Let's crack on. Let's say we're moving through the system with that athlete. That athlete is developing expertise and experience and training education. A year and a half later, we're having a slightly different conversation. Here's what we're doing. What do you think of that? Is there anything there that you have a doubt about that we need to tweak now? No? Okay, great. Crack on. Move on a few years and it's like start of the season. Okay, let's debrief last season. Let's talk about what worked, what didn't. What are you feeling is helping? What are you feeling isn't helping? What are your concerns? And you go into it in much more depth and you give the athlete much more a hand in their own training planning. And it's kind of a gradual flip of the coach as the total director, controller of training to nearly, in some cases, a coach is just a sounding board and the athlete as the kind of the master of their own destiny. So I don't know if that answered that question, but that's the way I kind of see it evolving. I think as regards what I was saying about placebo, I think I don't think we should look at deceiving the athlete in any way.
No.
But I do think we should look at highlighting positives, highlighting opportunities, and just being a positive influence around them. And being a positive influence can be, you know what, that was a crappy comp. Whatever, you bombed out at that weight, you shouldn't have. It was, should have been routine.
He's talking to you, Josh. Talking to you.
But that's okay, because we'll work in it and we'll come up with a plan. And the next time you're in that situation, that won't happen. So I guess that's what I mean. And it's, so I guess we started off talking about periodization and physical training, and then the importance of stress management, and then, the importance of belief and faith and trust and buy-in associated with the coach. And I guess for me, the optimal planner, if such a person exists, gets those blended in the right proportions, in the right way, and adapts the right persona that fits with the athletes they work with. So if you think of it like that, it's easy.
It's as easy as that. This has been phenomenal. This has honestly been, easily one of my favorite shows of all time. I'm so kind of feeling inspired to go back and get on with my coaching and do a better job. One thing that I do want to do before we go, and I feel like I have to do this. So you've seen so many incredible athletes in the gym, and one of the things that weightlifters are obsessed with is numbers. What can this guy squat? What can this guy power clean, snatch, whatever it might be. Do you have any particular moments where you've seen, whether it was one of the forwards in the Irish team who's just incredibly strong, and any memorable lifts, particularly with a barbell in the gym, that you've seen from some of the athletes that you've been around?
So I guess because I've been around the block a few times, there's you see quite a lot, so it takes quite a bit to
impress you. Yeah.
Well, not to impress, because they all impress me, but to do a double take, to go,
yeah.
What the hell was that?
Yeah.
And for me, it tends not to be load on bar, but there's a point in some lifts where there's an ignition point. Mm-hmm. It's where they have to drop a gear and just accelerate. Mm-hmm. And I think it's something that's extremely hard to train sometimes. And I'm not even 100% sure myself if you can make great changes in it, but there is that ignition spot that the athlete flicks a switch in somewhere in their brain, and this signal just flashes down and activates lots of muscle. So I have seen a couple of athletes like that. I worked with, this is maybe 2004, I worked with a rugby player who was British and Irish Lions.
Who was it, out of interest? Because there was the 05 Lions.
I'm searching my brain for his head.
What position, at least? Do you remember the position? Because I was so into rugby at that period.
Yeah, he was a wing forward. Dave Wallace.
Oh,
Dave
okay.
Wallace.
Yeah.
And it was just electric. It was like a clean from high hang.
Yeah.
Was it racked? I think it was a clean from high hang on a rack.
Yeah.
And it's an exercise I've used with, triple jumpers, for example, who are just extremely powerful.
Yeah.
But that guy had something, and it was just that flick that switch and just everything lights up and boom, it's 0 to now. There's a couple of really good jumpers I've worked with who had that as well.
Yeah.
I guess the field sports version of that is just there are some players that it's not even their acceleration over 3 or 5 meters, but it's when their foot touches the ground, how quickly they can accelerate. That 1-2 step acceleration. There's an Irish player called Keith Earls. Who is just phenomenal at it. He is just, but Dave Wallace now would have been probably 5 stone heavier than him.
Yeah. Do you remember Jason Robinson?
Sure, absolutely.
Because he's the guy that I think of as just being so fast in 2 or 3 steps. Yeah,
and it's all about just that ability to be nice and stiff on contact, and it just is it's probably a combination of structure in terms of bones, joints, the way they fit together is just perfect, and then just the right muscle qualities. But it is certainly a gift, and it's something that is extremely hard to train or improve. It's kind of one of these you either have it or you don't. Sure.
All right, well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. John, you are an absolute legend. Can you point people in the direction to find you or find more about you, or any places you want people to go?
Well, I guess I'm on Twitter at Simply Sports I have an Instagram account under the same name. For anyone who wants to see any of the papers from an academic perspective, then I have a page on ResearchGate that has all my publications on them. But thanks for all the kind words. I don't think I can quite live up to those expectations, but thank you very much.
Well, I think you're already doing it, and we'll link to everything down below. So guys, if you're listening in or watching actually, then you'll be able to find just down below in the description all of these places. Follow John on Twitter, Instagram, and read some of the research papers. Josh, any final words before we end this one?
No, thanks for coming on, John. It was a pleasure.
Yeah,
awesome.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Fantastic. All right, guys. Thank you once again for tuning in to today's episode of the Weightlifting House podcast, and we'll catch you all on the next episode.